Viña.
We are Vineyard.
I was seeing a coach a number of years ago where I went in one day complaining about one of my colleagues, and he listened and did a really good job of listening. And then finally said, well, so why don't you go work it out with him? And I said, oh, I don't want to do that. And he said, Jim, you know the verse in Matthew about go work it out with your brother if your brother offends you.
Right, totally.
You've preached sermons on that. Well, he finally taught me into going and trying to work it out with him. Right. And the story that I would tell is it went very badly.
Right.
Like I tried to obey the scripture, the teachings of Jesus, and it made the situation worse.
Right.
Short form of the story is I had to go 4 times. It got better each time, but people who would agree with this intellectually, when you put it into practice, things actually relationally often get harder at first.
Yes.
Before they get better. Because formation is not about information. The information is important, but it's about relational and missional practice.
Yes.
Your brain functions in a way that it would rather stay in a place that's not working than it would risk getting into the unknown.
Yes.
I mean, for me, that's the fundamental answer. Is that it's just a great distinction between the way we've used the words of discipleship and what I think what we mean when we talk about the work of spiritual formation.
Welcome to the We Are Vineyard podcast, conversations to help us grow with Jesus and each other. This week's episode is a continuation of our Leadership Under Pressure series. In this episode, Jay's going to be talking with Jim Herrington. Jim has been a pastor for close to 50 years, a congregational coach, and is the co-founder of The Leader's Journey. Let's listen in.
Jim, thanks for joining us on We Are Vineyard, and we were talking briefly. You said you've listened to a few of these, so you get a sense of how it goes. And I've been looking forward to talking to you because we've known each other a long time at this point, and gotten to share a lot of experiences together. And my favorite thing is introducing friends to friends. There's actually nothing more fun in the world than saying, I know you and I know you, and I really want you guys to meet. So I've loved working with you, and even in the role that I've gotten to have in the Vineyard and the things we've gotten to do together. So it's been really, really fun, not just in our local church, but across the country. So I'm excited to introduce you to more of my friends. It's basically.
Thanks. Well, that street runs both ways. I really appreciated and valued our relationship. Over the years, we've had some really good moments, and we've worked through some really hard moments, and that makes a friendship richer.
It does. Yes.
So I'm glad to be here today.
Yeah, it's good. Okay, so let's start where all good stories start, which is where you were born and where you grew up.
I was born in Lake Providence, Louisiana. Main Street runs into the Mississippi River, so right on the river, and just 12 miles south of the Arkansas line. It's a farming community. I grew up working on farms, cattle farms, cotton field farms, till I went off to college.
Huh.
I'm a country boy.
Yeah, I guess so. I knew that, but I don't think I knew it quite to that detail. That is about as country boy as a country boy can be, I think.
My very first job was when I was in the 4th grade, and I did what they call chopping cotton. I wasn't actually chopping the cotton. I was in the cotton field with a hoe, and what I was doing was chopping the weeds. I don't know why they call it chopping cotton, but every summer from the 4th to about the 6th grade, I did that. And then I started driving tractors and riding horses and participating in cattle drives. And people who only know me as an adult don't have any clue.
No.
But that's a part of my history.
Wow, that's funny.
And I love that.
That's wild. That's so cool. What a cool background. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
I have none of that, literally none. I mean, I'm a suburban, urban kid. So
City boy, yeah.
Yeah, so watching Yellowstone, I'm that's another universe that I can't quite process, but I enjoy learning about it. Okay, so you grow up like that, and were your parents were farmers, farming?
No, my dad was a high school football coach, teacher, turned principal, turned superintendent of schools. But his best friend was a guy named Jack Brown, who owned the largest acreage in East Carroll Parish. Jack raised cotton and soybeans and rice, and then he had about 10,000 head of Black Angus cattle. And so sometimes we're working in the field and sometimes we're doing cattle drives. And he had a son my age, and we were good friends and
Hmm.
spent summers and holidays and all of that together.
Okay.
And yeah,
And again, I don't want to assume anything, but I
yeah,
assume in like that kind of environment, church is like a part of life. Like, am I getting
yeah,
that right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Grew up in a very traditional kind of fundamentalist Southern Baptist church. Sunday morning, Sunday night. Tuesday night was teachers and officers meeting, and we were there. And Wednesday night was prayer meeting, and we were there.
Wow.
All of my friends, my closest friends went to that church.
So it's the center of life. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it was the center of the not just the church life, but the community life.
Mm-hmm.
My dad was a deacon and a Sunday school teacher. My mom sang in the choir and was a Sunday school teacher. And like our lives, just that was the center of our lives.
That's so cool. And so when you
Yeah.
think back on those times as you get up to high school, when you start to move into high school through high school, what do you think you're going to do? Who do you think you're going to be? I mean, besides the fact that every young man thinks he's going to play baseball or football until they're not, or something, but like outside of that
Well,
kind of thing, what did you start to think?
anybody who knows me has heard me tell the story that I got the Barney Fife body type. So I was 5'8", 5'8", and weighed 119 pounds when I married Betty. So I never dreamed about being a professional athlete or even thinking about playing in college. My family's family business is education. As I said,
Mm,
my dad was a teacher. My wife is a teacher. I have three kids who've taught. I consider what I do teaching, and so
mm-hmm,
I think I thought I was going to be a teacher in some rural Northeast Louisiana community. That
mm.
was and then I got a call to ministry when I was about 17 years old. I spent a summer in Ridgecrest, North Carolina, where Asheville, where the heart of the storm
Oh
has been
yeah,
recently.
yeah.
Had this just phenomenal fall, it's so real on the side of a mountain in midnight in what they call the prayer garden,
Mm,
and this will tell you something about me. I experienced this almost verbal call to ministry, and what I said to God was, "I will do this, but I'm not doing church like the church that I go to does church,"
mm.
which was a pretty rebellious
Yeah,
response,
exactly.
but
Yeah,
tells you a lot about who I was at
right.
that stage of my life. Like when I tell my story, there are two parallel things that impacted me. My dad was not only all those things that I said, he was an All-American college football player,
Mm,
and I wasn't.
right.
When he was growing up, he was raised by his grandmother because his parents were alcoholics. And
Mm.
then his grandmother I learned this when I was 40 years old. My grandmother was shot and killed in his presence when he was 14 years old.
Whoa.
And so at 40, I learned, oh, my dad had a lot of trauma in his life.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, he's a great guy. People come from all over the country when he dies to come to his funeral. He's been a coach and a mentor. And what's also true is my home was a really dangerous place to live in.
Mm.
Sometimes he could get his trauma, could get triggered, and he could become violent. And so, with my dad, he's this great guy. He led the court order integration process with the NAACP
Wow.
state president. The two of them did that while the Protestant churches were building a private school. And while he was pretty emotionally distant, one of the most intimate moments I had with him was when he stood in our living room and said, "If we believe anything about the gospel, we've got to do this."
Mm.
And this was stay in the public schools and do this integration.
Wow.
And so I graduated in a class of 129 as the only white kid in the class. And I don't mean to pretend that I understood what a minority was. Like I still was in a culture where white people dominated, but it shaped my world, and I formed some friendships there. And so that happened. And then the
Mm.
parallel story is this church, this fundamentalist church, where I was really loved well by some people who cared for me, who told me that I had gifts in ministry, who actually talked my parents. One couple talked my parents into letting me go to North Carolina, where I got the call to ministry.
Mm.
And what was also true was twice a year they did this, what they called a revival.
Right.
And they would bring a professional evangelist in, and he would just dangle me over the pits of hell with his words and his emotion. And I mean, I was probably 40 years old when I named that as trauma. It was a
Mm.
really twice a year. I'd walk the aisle two or three times,
Yeah.
confessing my sins, terrified that I was going to go to hell.
Right.
And so, like one way to form the story of my life is growing up in that little community. there were like it was good and bad. It was
Right.
painful and joyful. And what emerged over time, and particularly in the days after the call to ministry, was how is it possible for both of those things to coexist?
Yeah.
Like, how could my dad love the Lord, go to church, know the Bible, and then do what he was doing to me?
Right.
How could the church love the Lord, know the Bible, really, really be committed to all that, and then do what they were doing,
Yeah.
not only to me, but to other kids that they were raising? And so there's been this kind of lifelong journey of trying to figure that out,
Yeah.
trying to understand how that happens and what is that just a given that we all have to live with, or is there something going on that if we could address it
Mm.
and correct it could make a difference? And
Mm.
one way to tell the story of my life, I did an
Yeah.
undergraduate degree in psychology, I did a master's degree
Yeah.
in theological education, and my senior thesis was in how adults learn, and
Hmm.
my DMin is in spiritual direction, spiritual formation. All of that was me trying to figure out how people change and
Yes.
why all of that happened. So yeah, all of that.
Well, and it connects the dot of why, when you receive a call that you experience from God, your first thing you want to say back is, okay, as long as
Right, exactly,
I'm going to do
exactly.
this different. That connects those dots pretty easily. And it's what I know to be true, and I think you believe to be true, because we've talked about things like this, is
Right,
people's opinions and behaviors make sense when you understand their experiences, right?
totally, totally,
When I
totally.
understand what you felt and thought and experienced and how you reacted or shaped your life in light of that, your behavior suddenly makes sense to me. Like, oh,
Yeah,
okay, that
yeah,
explains that anger or that drivenness or whatever. All of a sudden,
yeah,
like, oh, that makes sense. And you
yeah,
describing learning that about my dad much later helped me
yeah.
see it. Like, oh, that connects some dots.
I mean,
Okay, good.
in a nanosecond, it was like it happened standing in front of my grandmother's grave. We were at a family funeral, and
Hmm.
he said out loud that she had been shot and killed. I didn't know that. And it was like in a nanosecond, it was like, oh,
Yeah,
your behavior has not been as much about me as it's been about you,
yeah,
about your experience.
yeah,
And it created, like, I can look back and see that became the opening for some real compassion for him that
yeah.
had been missing.
Right. Yep. No, that's powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, so next thing we know, Jim is being star student. There's masters. There's I'm now going to become pastor of pastors, and you end up then in Texas. You're in Houston, right? Leading it not too long after that,
Yeah.
as you come out of seminary and do
About
everything.
15 years. Yeah,
Okay,
about
so it
15
takes a
years.
while. Okay.
Yeah, so I did college and work simultaneously. So I joke
Okay.
and say I crammed a 4-year college degree into 7 years because I was working in the church part time
Mm-hmm.
and got married and had my first kid.
Wow.
And so we did youth ministry in Monroe, Louisiana, had a baby and had
Mm.
moved to University of Arkansas where we graduated, went with the pastor from Monroe who moved up there,
Mm.
and had another baby, graduated there, moved to Fort Worth and did seminary there, did a 3-year degree in 6 years,
Mm.
and had another baby there, and then moved to Houston in '83, and I became the executive director and served a church here. Had another baby, had a baby all the places we lived, and then in '89 became the executive director of UBA, Union Baptist Association.
Wow. So yeah,
Yeah,
that's meteoric
yeah,
rise to fame and
yeah,
leadership.
yeah.
And so your career track's rolling. I mean, you're like, okay, everything that I could imagine I want to be. Now you're doing a whole different kind of work.
Hmm.
So what were the pivots that made you start to say, wait a minute, there might be another track for me? What were the key moments you started to think, maybe I'm not just going to keep growing a church or leading churches that are growing or in just a
Hmm.
denominational role? How did you start to see maybe even your own training differently or even your own call?
Oh, I've never had the question asked exactly like that. when I went to work at UVA, I had always been an associate pastor somewhere. I'd never been the senior leader.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden, like it's a whole long story about how that ended up. They were looking for a 55-year-old PhD with senior pastor experience who had served the denomination. I was 35 years old and had never been a senior pastor.
Hmm.
And the association had been for 40 years, the membership had been declining while the
Right.
city had been doing, had been growing.
Mm.
And so in the first 2 years, I think there are probably two things that really shifted for me. One was we did a longitudinal study that described what I just said: 40 years of decline, 40
Right.
years of growth in the city. And the other was that I discovered that I really had some charisma and some change agency. Like charisma is not the right word. I had a high tolerance for risk, I think was what I would
Mm.
say.
Mm.
So we began to do a series of pilot projects with Baptist pastors, multicultural groups. We had 16 pastors in three different groups. And then we did a 5-year thing in Houston called the Leader's Journey. What we
Hmm.
came to believe out of the initial pilot projects was that the denomination had a cookie cutter approach to a very diverse context.
Mm.
And so we were going to, instead of doing the cookie cutter thing, which had been done for all of the history of the association, we were going to become consultants that help churches develop strategies
Mm.
that were unique to their context and their calling. And then from those pilot projects, we did a 5-year project that had about 250 pastors in the city go through. And what I learned in all of that was I love trying things and then getting up in the balcony and looking to see what we learned.
Hmm.
And so fast forward 25 years, Tricia and I get invited to Western Seminary in Holland, Michigan to do what became a 10-year project with the Reformed Church in America and the Christian
Hmm.
Reformed Church in America that focused on personal and congregational transformation.
Hmm.
And George Hunsberger, who's a missiologist, was on the team that called me, and he said to us, or he called us, and he said to us in the initial interview, he said, "You're the only people that we know. We're not saying you're the only people doing this, but you're the only people we know who have a working theory of personal and congregational transformation that you're out there actually field testing and then
Hmm.
changing the working theory based on the results you get." And I thought, I love that. In that moment, it was the first
Yeah.
time anybody had named that.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And then the other thing is that in about the first or second year of that work, I denominationally got connected to 11 other men, all men, who were directors of missions. That was our title, our
Mm.
executive director, in cities where there are churches, cities of more than 1 million people.
Mm.
And we began to come together, and we discovered that all of us were having this very same
Mm.
deal. Cities growing like this, churches in decline.
Yeah.
And so we began to meet twice a year. And it was the very first, what I later learned to call and came to experience as a learning community.
Hmm.
And so we'd come together twice a year for a couple of days, work on building trust between us and working on talking about, what we're experimenting with, what we're learning, blah, blah, blah. And again, that was really a dynamite experience for me
Mm.
that kind of shaped my understanding of how learning takes place.
Mm.
I would probably name this third thing. There was a season in all of that. In those first 2 or 3 years, there were three books. One by Dallas Willard, his book, The Divine Conspiracy, changed the
Hmm.
world, the way that I see the world. One by a guy named Peter Senge, who wrote the book, The Fifth Discipline, the Art and Practice of the Learning Organization, and then one by Murray Bowen, that's about family systems theory.
Hmm.
It was the first time in my life that somebody articulated for me that we experience the world and we make meaning of what that experience is, and we don't realize we're making meaning. We think that's the way the world is,
Yeah.
and that when you can get that up here and examine it, you get access to information and experience that you don't have access to otherwise. Senge is the one who's called them mental models,
Yep.
and like that changed the way I saw the world. It,
Mm.
it made me a change agent in a way that I think I never would have been if I was just trying to figure out how do you take what we're already doing and make it better.
Right.
Like, I don't think that's possible.
Right. Right. Right.
I
Right.
used to think that was possible, but I
Yeah.
don't think that's possible. And I would say that that all of that resource and material I've read those 3 books 10 times.
Yeah.
And every time I think, this is brand new.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then I remember, oh no, you're different, Jim. The material's not different. You're different,
Exactly.
which is an humbling experience.
Yeah, it is a humbling experience. Well, and especially, I mean, the books you just described or will do that as much as anything I've ever read. I mean, because
Yeah.
they're so robust and rich, and they're moving pretty quickly through a lot of different ways of thinking that
Yeah. Yeah.
you think you're following it, but you're really only following parts of it. And then,
Right.
and then as
Exactly.
you live into it for a minute, you go back and read it and go, oh, that now actually makes sense. Now that I've actually lived into this part, I can
Yeah.
read this next part, and it actually makes sense differently. That's definitely my experience of the 3 you just mentioned.
Yeah.
And that is our funny interaction is in the space that you're describing, where you're doing some city movement stuff. You and I finally connect in New York.
In New York, right?
And
At a city reaching gathering.
that's exactly right. And I said, you asked me, as you do, you're great at asking questions. You asked me.
So I think we ought to set the context. We were on a bicycle in
Yeah,
Central Park.
yeah, exactly. Yes. And you asked me, what are you learning? What are you thinking about these days? And I said, I think there's something about spiritual formation and like systems thinking and missional living that fit together somehow. I don't know how they fit together, but I can tell they do. It's working in my heart. It's working in my life out of some of my own brokenness, getting therapy here, and then working on this stuff. And then I've always had a missional heart. And I'll never forget you just staring at me. And as I remember it, I remember you saying back, "Are you making fun of me? Is this like a joke?" And I said, "No, I don't," because we didn't really know each other.
Right.
And you were like, I've written books about this. I've written about this. And I was like, you have? And I went and grabbed your book and read it that night in New York.
Mm.
And then that next day, I'm like, we should talk about this. And you were like, let's just walk out of here and keep talking. And we did that. And because you were just ahead. You had done the work I was starting to explore, trying to figure out how to integrate those things. And you were like, that's what I've been doing. I was like, then let's do it. What do we got to do? And we'd been, at least in our church, playing with things like, okay, let me take this thing I've learned in my own family systems work, and let me try to apply that to our team. And then I bet we could start to build something that looks like a rule of life on practices we're going to do together. And then let's build some really concrete missional frameworks that will help us live this stuff out. And so we were just playing around with things. And it was producing a lot of health and also a decent amount of chaos in our context. And so to see someone like, oh, you've actually built some maps here that integrate these things was just really an answer to prayer. It was a gift to me. And that was faith walking at the time.
Right.
And so I did, the different things. And then as a church, we started adapting things. And your book, Leader's Journey, which I, again, talked to Tricia as well. I'm just so grateful. So as I was thinking about our time today, Tricia was joking with me when we were on together that it's super great to be able to have more than one edition of a book because you get to go and take stuff out.
Right.
That you don't want to say anymore and add some new things. Let's operate under the assumption people have read some of your work or have looked at faith walking or even our emotionally focused as sort of,
Right.
We're adapting some of that to be more congregational. What is it that you think you've learned? Well, let me pause here and say, if you've not read that book and you're listening to us, you should read that. Okay. Second, let's assume you've read some of that. You're starting to play with some of those frameworks. You're trying some things in your own life. What do you think you've learned from writing that after? Like, I'm sure it's a lot, but when you have to edit and add things and subtract things, what kinds of things are you doing differently?
Well, one of the things we're doing differently is we're framing the conversation differently. this is so much of the work of spiritual formation, which is what faith walking emotionally focused on, those kinds of things are,
Mm-hmm.
is when we think about spiritual formation, we have a mental model that is about discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
And discipleship is this information based, listen to this podcast, go to this sermon, fill in the notes when I'm at the sermon,
Mm-hmm.
a couple of religious practices. And one of the things that shifted really deeply for me is when I use the word spiritual, I'm referring to your inner life.
Mm-hmm.
I'm referring to, and I think about your inner life in the same way that I think about the human body. The human body is made up of 6 or 7 subsystems, each of which serves a purpose, and each of which is you're healthy when they're all functioning at a high level.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some things that when they interact with each other that can't be produced by any subsystem.
Mm-hmm.
And so David Benner and Dallas Willard shaped me a lot. I have a simplified version of what both of them use, where I just talk about you think, you feel, you have a will, you can set goals and achieve things, and you have passion.
Mm-hmm.
And each of those serve a purpose. And so moving it to that, and then thinking about that from the frame of each one of those is like a muscle that has to be developed and strengthened and ongoingly strengthened.
Mm-hmm.
That has been a real foundational kind of shift for me. I was on a call yesterday with day before yesterday with the pastor of a church, not a Vineyard church, but a real great church up in Indianapolis. And this guy's doing great work, really great personal reflection. He sees some behaviors where he just gets triggered and automatically he just does what his autopilot has him to do. And he asked me to talk about what are the things that have helped me to notice the triggering before it got too far down the road.
Mm-hmm.
And what I recognized as I shared my answers to that, what I recognized was that not only do I use this internal definition of what spiritual is. It's not religion. It's not it's not the antonym to secular, but it's
Mm-hmm.
just growing this internal life. What I also recognized was that at 71 years of age, I am still learning to see myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so the neurosciences would say that somewhere between 60 and 80% of everything you do on a daily basis is on autopilot. You don't wake up in the morning and think, how do I tie my shoes, or how do I fix my breakfast, or even something really complex like driving a car.
Yeah.
You can actually do that without ever thinking about turning on a blinker or putting the car and drive, any of that kind of stuff. And what the neurosciences are teaching us is that is just profoundly true. And what the spiritual formation work is teaching me is that there is this lifelong journey of learning to see myself.
Mm-hmm.
And like I can see myself better than I've ever seen myself, but I don't see myself fully. Paul's saying I see through a glass dimly.
Yeah.
But at every stage, there's another layer of the onion gets peeled back. And if Paul says take off the old self, well, if I can't see the old self,
Yeah.
then how do I take it off?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so the focus on the internal life, and then the set of disciplines and practices that are designed to help me take that off. And maybe the third thing that just comes to mind as I talk is to not feel any shame about the fact that that's not a one and done deal.
That's what I was going to ask you is
Yeah.
the resistance to the work you're describing is that makes me feel bad.
Right.
I mean,
vulnerable. It makes you feel like it shames you and you feel vulnerable.
Yeah. And so how do you build resilience for that? Because the reason we don't like to pay attention to ourselves
Mm-hmm.
is we notice exactly what you're saying, how much of what we're doing we're not even thinking about. And that feels weird. That feels strange to notice.
Right.
It's like realizing I've had ketchup on my face, my fly's down, and I have something in my teeth. And it's been that way forever, apparently. And now I'm learning that. That feels strange. And at best strange. At worst, I feel embarrassed. I feel ashamed.
Right.
And I jump into action. Like, well, I'm going to wipe my face off. I'm going to, whatever you want to try to fix things that often aren't fixed very quickly. So how do you build the kind of resilience to do that work?
Well, one of my favorite sayings is that the gap between expectation and reality is always filled with anxiety.
Hmm.
So you've got a daughter who's a senior in high school, and if she's supposed
Mm-hmm.
to be in at 11 o'clock, you don't feel any anxiety if she comes in at 11 o'clock. If she comes in at 10 after, the anxiety increases. If she comes in at midnight, if she comes in at 2 o'clock, I mean, it just keeps increasing the bigger the gap
Right.
gets.
Totally.
And as a coach, one of the things that I do from the get-go is to say, this is a long, slow process. If you're
Hmm.
looking for me to do, 6 sessions and you're out, or I might send a coaching call, it'd be really great if I could say this to you. And you say, oh, okay, I'll go do that.
Right. Right.
And so, like, closing the gap between, as a guy who grew up in the Bible Belt where discipleship was about knowing the Bible, I know the Bible. I can quote some verses in 3 translations because of that, but I couldn't do the Bible, right? Knowing the Bible is like if you've got a brain and are willing to work at it, you can know the Bible. But
Mm-hmm.
doing the Bible requires the disrupting the old self and putting on the new self, and that takes a lot of practice.
Mm-hmm.
And so narrowing the gap between the expectation gap. I think the other thing is creating a community of people where it's safe, where we're fluent in the language of shame, where it's common. This guy that I was talking about in Indianapolis is working on some stuff, some really deep stuff, and he has actually stood up in front of his staff and said, "I am working on this,
Mm-hmm.
and I am struggling, and I'm going to make some mistakes, and I need you to don't embarrass me in public, but I
Right.
need you to, So there's a community where that's possible.
Mm.
I think, yeah, yeah. I'm sorry, story just came to mind. Um,
Yeah, I want to hear it now for sure.
well, it's so silly, and yet it's so profound. So there's 2 pieces to it. Trish and I've worked together for 25 years,
Mm-hmm.
and in our young adult years, I was a stereotypical take charge, assertive,
Mm-hmm.
Enneagram 8 kind of guy, and she was kind of the stereotypical peacekeeping,
Mm-hmm.
accommodating gal. And we've worked together for 25 years, and over time, we've become more and more authentic with one another and named the challenges that we face, and
Mm-hmm.
have grown our capacity to be really attuned to each other and to show up as our true selves. And so we've got this team of about now 10 coaches, and we do a monthly meeting where we all gather. And then Tricia and I have a regular Friday meeting. When we one of our Friday meetings, she said, "I got a question I want to ask you." And I could tell by her tone of voice that she's
Here we
fixing to
go.
get
Right.
courageous
Yeah.
with
Right.
me. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
And so I'm doing pretty good because I recognize that that's challenging for her. And she says, when we're on the coaching calls with the team, I don't know if you're aware of this, but you frequently will cross your arms and you'll look away from the screen. And she said, it seems like you've gotten angry, or like the other meaning that I make is that you're just not interested in what we're talking about.
Mm.
Well, the first thing is I am oblivious to that behavior.
Yes. You're not even aware
Right?
you did that.
I don't know I'm doing that.
Right.
What I'm doing, and the meaning I'm making is somebody's just said something that I want to think about,
Mm-hmm.
and so I go over here to think about it. And so we have that conversation, and then I say, "So how long have you known this?"
Mm.
And she said, "Oh, for a while now."
Mm-hmm.
And then my anger came right up to here. So
Yeah.
why the hell haven't you told me this?
Yes.
We've
Yeah.
made this agreement that we're going to give each other feedback, and why
Right.
haven't you told me this? Well,
Right.
a part of what she says is, so I noticed it, but it's not like something that is where I'm just hyper focused. I see it,
Right.
and then I go on with the conversation, and then I see it.
Right. Right.
And so all of that is like creating a space. And
Mm.
we're as good at it as anybody I know. And
Yeah.
it's still challenging to
Yeah.
say, to give feedback, to hear the feedback.
Mm-hmm.
So creating a community where you can do, where you can have those kind of conversations, where leaders are doing that publicly, where you can talk about shame, where what spiritual formation is. All of those, I think, are the other thing that would come up for me.
Mm. And so you're introducing thoughts that I would struggle to believe that someone would disagree. So like what you're saying right now, There's certain things people offer that are helpful that you disagree with. Like,
Totally.
actually, I don't agree with that.
Right.
The things you're saying now, I think most anyone I know. So you're saying I need to become more self-aware. A, I need to have a community by which I can process that. B, sure, I'm in. Like, what? I don't think. I mean, maybe there'd be someone that would disagree, but I think most people would agree. Specifically, if you've led for more than a week. I mean, if you've led for more than a week, or you've had to follow somebody for more than a week, you would definitely want your leader to do what we're describing. What are the impediments? What's between here and there? What makes it so people don't get this done when it seems so obvious?
Well, I mean, you just put on full display the distinction between discipleship, as we've used that term, and spiritual formation.
Mm-hmm.
Like intellectually, this makes perfect sense to me.
Totally.
I was seeing a coach a number of years ago, where I went in one day complaining about one of my colleagues, and he listened and did a really good job of listening. And then finally he said, "Well, so why don't you go work it out with him?" And I said, "Oh, I don't want to do that." And he said, Jim, you know the verse in Matthew about go work it out with your brother if your brother offends you.
Right, totally.
You've preached sermons on that. Well, he finally taught me into going and trying to work it out with him.
Right.
And the story that I would tell is it went very badly.
Right.
Like I tried to obey the scripture, the teachings of Jesus, and it made the situation worse.
Right.
Short form of the story is I had to go 4 times. It got better each time, but people who would agree with this intellectually, when you put it into practice, things actually relationally often get harder at first.
Yes.
Before they get better. Because formation is not about information. It's not. I mean, the information is important, but it's about relational and missional practice.
Yes.
Your brain functions in a way that it would rather stay in a place that's not working than it would risk getting into the unknown.
Yes.
I mean, for me, that's the fundamental answer. Is that it's just a great distinction between the way we've used the words of discipleship and what I mean. I think what we mean when we talk about the work of spiritual formation.
Well, and you gave a good example there, which is, and I'm adding to what you said, so you can disagree with me, is a third thought is you need somehow to be relinquishing power and authority to allow people to reflect with you, to be curious, to ask questions about what is possible. Like, well, what if you did this? What would happen? And most leaders are in charge. One of the things that makes them feel most secure is the fact that they're in charge.
Right, exactly.
So what you did in that moment was you were willing to not be in charge. Like, I'm going to let someone else impact and influence my thinking, my behavior, in a way that makes me uncomfortable, that I'm not sure it's going to work.
In 2 ways. One was I gave up power by going to do what he asked me to do. And the other was that I gave up power by coming back and saying, I don't like you today. This didn't go very well. I don't want to do this anymore. But as we talked, ultimately, he helped me to go back. He helped me see some things that I hadn't seen, helped me, role play some stuff, just helped see where I got triggered. And I went again. It wasn't a one and done deal. There was this circular process over a 2-3 week period of time that was, that's what you said. I totally agree with that is that you give up power to be in charge, because if you're in charge, you're just going to do what you've been doing.
Exactly.
It's so hard for us to see ourselves.
Yes.
And we're really great at, it's Murray Bowen who said, we don't ever ask the question why. We ask what, how, when, where. We don't ask why because we are notorious for making up amazing excuses for why we do the things we do.
Yes, that is, or why the world is the way it is. Yeah,
why the world is the way it is.
Ultimately, us projecting that.
you're interested in more of the work Vineyard USA is doing to promote healthy pastors and leaders, we'd encourage you to check out the Pastoral Health Information page on our website. Go to vineyardusa.org/pastoral health to learn about resources, upcoming cohorts, and support from the Vineyard USA team.
Here's another thing I wanted to ask you about, because I've been thinking about it. And, I've talked with Trisha. I've talked with Chuck DeGroat. I've talked with different people who are, their history, there's a lot of their background are they're clinicians.
Mm-hmm.
And clinicians have all kinds of ways that A, they're trained, and B, the world is structured around them so that they have to be open to input, right? So if you're a clinician and you're certified, you have to have a mentor. You have to have somebody who looks at your caseload with you. So sometimes monthly, sometimes quarterly, there's different laws in different places. I mean, of course, you would never have seen this because you love Jesus, but like the show The Sopranos, which
I watched The Sopranos.
Okay. Well, some people, would be offended by that.
Talk to me anymore,
people may be offended to know that people watch that show. But one of the most interesting things that I think the American public learned watching that is that counselors have counselors.
Yeah.
Then they all do, by the way. If you're a clinician, you kind of have to. And that counselor's removed enough from what you do to be able to give you objective feedback. And your insurance depends on that, frankly. And your licensure depends on that. And if you end up caught in a mess later and you didn't tell your supervisor, that's a big deal. Now, if you told your supervisor you're working on it, okay, at least the system held up. And what they do is really complicated work, obviously, when you're a clinician. I don't know that as a pastor, our work's any less complicated. I mean, the way we're involved in people's lives in the most traumatic parts of their life, the way we offer counsel, the way we distribute and move in power. And yet most pastors don't have anything that would resemble what a clinician is doing. Think with me about that. How would, if I'm a pastor and I'm realizing, man, I'm interacting with stuff that's way outside of my pay grade, or maybe I'm asking you a different question. Is how do you think we got here? Why are we here? What are some moves we can make to do that differently? Because it seems like a vital piece of having healthy systems, I think, if you're a pastor.
Yeah, I totally agree. But Tricia and I were doing a podcast with Todd Bolsinger about a year, maybe a year and a half ago. And one of the things that he said is if I was a bishop or in some kind of denominational tradition where there was a hierarchy, I would require every pastor to be seeing a coach, a counselor, or a spiritual director. And I think that's true. I mean, I think what you're describing is that in the kind of professional settings that we're in, we deal with really complex things. The complexity of it triggers us in a variety of ways. Can trigger us in a variety of ways. There's an ego that's involved in that. I mean, so much of the spiritual abuse that we see happening that maybe has been happening all along, I don't know, but we're certainly way more aware of it today than we've ever been. I mean, all of that reflects just the fact that as a pastor, I'm a human being, and I have an ego, and I get called into places where I don't necessarily know what I'm doing, or I think I know what I'm doing, but I don't, or like just all that stuff that you would say. It's just so I'm processing out loud. I grew up in the Baptist tradition. I think it's similar in the Vineyard tradition where the local church is autonomous. And what I can see about myself is that in some ways I felt the call to ministry because I felt powerless and I wanted to be powerful. And I can see places along the way where the desire to be powerful produced some really bad results, hurt some people. And I can also see how, I mean, I've been in counseling since I was 25 or 26 years old, off and on all my life, about to get into another counseling relationship next week. I think I told you that before we started the call. And I can look back and see that if I hadn't had that, if I hadn't had that, I would have been much less effective. I would have hurt people that I didn't intend to. I would have gotten hurt. I would probably ended up being resigned and cynical. So the free church tradition, like Baptist and Vineyard, I think is a part of that. I think a part of that is like we just know a truckload of stuff today that we didn't know 20 years ago.
That's true. Yep.
Like, what do we know about trauma? What do we know about implicit bias? What did we know about power dynamics?
Right.
And a part of the reason I need somebody that I can talk to is I don't have time to go study all that stuff and do my job too.
Yes,
But I need to be
exactly.
able to go talk to somebody who knows and let them be
Yes.
my teacher.
Yes.
I don't know. What else would you add to that? How else do you think we got here?
I don't know. I think your observation about being Baptist or being Vineyard is really important.
Mm.
We like catalytic, fast-moving, big impact things.
Mm-hmm.
Just being American, we like that. It's interesting to see how that isn't just a product of the modern world, because there's other parts of the world, even the Western world, that's skeptical of those things,
Right.
because they see the negative impact
Right.
of big, fast, strong, bright, exciting. There's parts of the Western world that are like, we've played that game,
Right.
and people get hurt. So we're skeptical of that. We want there to be more checks and balances. Checks and balances slow things down.
They do.
They just do. They make us slower. They make us more accountable. In the most negative sense, they can give way or give space for fearful, anxious, protective stuff that we don't want. We want to be able to be brave and exciting and catalytic, and so it would be the negative. But of course, the positives are we're going to hurt less people and get hurt less ourselves. So what's strange is by taking control out of individuals, sometimes you put control in systems and the same bad behaviors happen. They just happen in the system now instead of individuals. And so I think in movements like the Vineyard, we've traded in saying, well, we'd rather hope for benevolent dictators than to have systems that will be dictators. And so as I've been doing this work and in the Vineyard, and this is what I want to ask you is, I think we've, in the Vineyard, and maybe even as Baptists, we built systems that are great for peacetime, but they don't work in wartime.
Yeah.
As long as everybody is really doing their very best and they work hard to do their best, it goes pretty well. It's still messy, but it goes pretty well. It's when something breaks at the relational level, the financial level, the moral, behavioral level, we're not prepared to act and react to that.
Yeah.
We're all shocked. We're all like, how could this happen? And the only way we can maintain our system is if that just kind of goes away somehow. Like we just kind of turn our heads and go do the next thing and hope that'll work out. It's like being in a city. I mean, you have to have a SWAT team in a city. You have to have a police department. Now, do you use your SWAT team every day? No. You have people that are specially trained to do very particular things in a very catastrophic scenario, right? And they hardly ever do what they do. I mean, that's what's crazy about it. It's like the fire department. People walk in there. I mean, that's the jokes, right? They're in there playing checkers and, hanging out, making meals together. But when you need them, you really need them. Because if it doesn't work, if they're not ready, man, part of your city might burn down.
Yeah.
I mean, there could be a lawlessness that breaks out. And so, yeah, that's my working theory. And so trying to figure out how do you build the right kinds of contexts without having it squelch all the opportunity. Because one way to have no crime in a city is have martial law. Okay, there's a curfew. Everybody's in their house when it's dark. Yeah, we'll have no crime, but we also won't have a very livable city. That's also not helpful. So we don't want to live in wartime when there is no war. But man, if something goes wrong, we need to be able to act and act swiftly.
Yeah, that triggers several things in me. I think that's right, and I think that whether it's an individual or a system,
Hmm.
you can increase the capacity of the individual or the system to function at a high level
Hmm.
through the ongoing, never-ending work of spiritual formation.
Hmm.
A mature, wise person is going to respond to war differently than a reactive, immature person.
Yes.
You're still going to be problematic. You're going to still need a SWAT team,
Yep.
but we're just all going to the overall result is going to be different. The thing that I find myself thinking a lot about is that you started out by saying in stable times and then in
Yeah.
wartime.
Yeah.
Well, as Todd Bolsinger again, one of my mentors and coaches, I've learned so much from him. Uses the language off map.
Yes.
Jerry Walling has this new book out where called okay, I'm not able to think. I'm having a senior moment. Um, both of them write about the fact that we're off map, and that
Mm.
when you're off map, you like it's always wartime.
Yes. Yes.
You never wake up in the morning and it's stable.
Yes.
You still need the SWAT team, who are well, maybe the SWAT teams are the ones who are going out and saying, "Hey guys, there's a river 5 miles over there that we got to be preparing for."
Right. Right.
But I think one of the like what we know is that your brain experiences change as threat.
Mm.
That's a neuroscience accepted deal. Even a change you want.
Yeah.
So when my kids went off to college, I laid on my bed when I got home from taking them and cried like a baby.
Yeah.
And I can remember saying to Betty, "We have worked for this all of our life. Why does it feel so bad?"
Yes.
It's
Yes.
because my brain experiences change as threat. And so we're off map and we're all trying to figure out,
Mm.
what does it look like for us to be faithful to the call of Jesus and the mission of God in the world that we live in?
Mm.
We don't really know what world we're living in anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you and I and the people we're associated with, we're all working on creating a new map.
Yes.
And the way I say it is, in the stable world, where we trained pastors, we were teaching people to read maps that somebody else had provided.
Mm.
Now what we're doing is we're teaching people how to make maps.
Yeah.
And the faulty thinking is, we'll actually endure discomfort if we think on the other side of the river is comfort.
Mm.
But there's no indication that the pace of change is going to slow down.
Yes.
And so we're going to continuously live in a changing context. And that's just going to create some challenges. I need a supervisor more than ever in that kind of
Yes. That's
context.
right. That's
I
exactly
mean,
right.
whether it's just somebody to go and say, "I hate this,"
Right.
like where you can vent and blow off steam, or where you can like think through values and beliefs and convictions, where you can,
Mm.
all the stuff that you do when you've got a counselor or a coach or a mentor. That all of that gets stirred up in me when you use that illustration.
No, that's good.
But to circle back around, yes, I think Todd's right. Every pastor ought to have somebody there that they are accountable to. And if I were a bishop, and where I had that authority, for you to be in my conference or my district or my diocese,
Hmm.
I'd have a team of coaches that or counselors that you would be required to see on a regular basis.
No, that's really good. That's really good. Okay, so I've taken a ton of your time. So I want to be cognizant of your time, but I want to ask. You've worked a lot with the Vineyard, so you know us pretty well.
Mhm.
You've been seeing all the changes we're going through,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I would just love. What would you want to say to us as you're watching, you're helping? What do you want to say that is like an encouragement, a challenge? Hey, look over here, pay attention to this.
Yeah.
What kinds of things do you think would be helpful for us to notice?
Well, so I want to say to your listeners, you didn't warn me you were going to ask me this, and you hadn't paid me to say what I'm about to say.
Oh
Uh,
no, okay, okay,
but I mean, Trish and I have been really deeply involved in the change process. We were
yes,
in a 3-day meeting where the reorg team reported to the executive team,
oh yeah,
and well, I mean, we're in that context, so we've been really deeply involved,
hmm,
and we view ourselves as some of the experts out there in change management.
yep,
I mean, how you've done this has been almost pitch perfect. And if somebody's listening and say, yeah, but this is really painful, or we had this conflict here, or what? Yeah, you did. That's what change does.
Mm-hmm.
Part of what happens is we look for some straight line. Like if we're doing this right, it's going to be easy, and we're just going to make our way to the other side. And you talked to me multiple times in that process. Caleb talked to me multiple times in that
Mm-hmm.
process, where we were thinking about the process. So that's the first thing I'd say is that
Mm-hmm.
the change process. I frequently refer to it when I'm talking to other people as one of the best examples that I've ever seen.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first thing I'd say. I think the second thing that I would say is I'm really hopeful. I mean, I'm coaching 4 vineyard churches and
Mm-hmm.
working, with their staff and their council and doing leadership stuff. And I'm really hopeful. Um, so there's a generational thing that's going on
Mm-hmm.
that we need to let be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there was a generation of guys who knew John Wimber who formed all these amazing churches all across the country
Yeah.
and really created a movement that I think God honored and blessed
Yeah.
and is so good. And what happened was the world changed while those guys were growing those churches. And when I talked to them, and I talked to several of them, you hear some version of the way we did it was right. And these new young leaders, I'm not so sure. I mean, they're not critical. It's not like this pastor is not doing a good job.
Right.
But like I had one guy say to me, to me of all people. So my young guy is my new pastor is trying to get us to do some work on emotional intelligence. Is that a thing? Is that really a thing?
I love it.
And so part of what I would say is that seems normal to me.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm 65, 70, 75 years old, have gotten to the epitome of success in the world that I live in by seeing the world and functioning in a certain way. I don't want anybody telling me that's not good. That's
You
not
got to do
okay.
it different. Right. Yeah.
Right. Like I want to be honored for that. I want to be
Mm-hmm.
celebrated for that. And what I would say to the younger guys is you've got to be true to yourself. You've got to
Mm-hmm.
be true to what you hear the Lord saying. And there's some really great stuff happening in these churches that I'm working with. I'm working with 2 of your largest and a couple of 3 more of your small churches, and where they're talking about going
Mm-hmm.
is transformative, not just for the church, but for the cities that they're located in. If
Mm-hmm.
they get anywhere close to doing what they say they think the Lord is calling them to do, and what I'm trying to say in all that is be faithful to that. Hear the voice of the older guys,
Mm-hmm.
honor that, but don't let it deter you.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
It does. It certainly
Yeah.
does. Yeah. Yeah. It's.
Holding 2 things in tension, on the one hand, honoring the past
Mm-hmm.
and also telling the truth about your off map. And you've got
Yeah.
to figure out that's going to be a different kind of deal.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are the 2 things that come to mind for me.
That's really good. That's really, really helpful. Yeah. Yeah. And I
And you
resonate.
didn't pay me to say that.
No, I did. I did. No, and I resonate. And you have been so helpful in so many of those conversations for me personally, for so many pastors I know. I've already said it, but you definitely need to read Leader's Journey if you've not read that. That's super helpful book for me. It's a book I return to quite often. I'm very grateful for that resource.
Thanks.
And what we've said, I mean, it's funny when we talk about books, when we just said information doesn't actually change us in the way we think it does. So information's important.
Right.
It's valuable. It's necessary, I would say.
Right.
And yet doesn't do the thing we think it does. You have to
Not enough.
actually practice stuff. You need people
Right.
that'll walk with you and ask you to do things you don't normally do, and get you to try things you've never tried, and help you build your resilience for when things go wrong, which they do.
Yep.
The more you try to change things. That's great. Those are helpful thoughts for the Vineyard, because I resonate, and I'm hopeful that we will continue to get to work together, Jim. And there's one last question I want to ask you, and I'm struggling to form it. which would just be something like, what else are you aware of out there? We've talked about a few different things that you would be like, man, you mentioned Bolsinger's work, who's also a friend of ours. We love him, and he's done stuff for us and with us. What else are you aware of out there that you're like, this is worth looking at? This is a resource. This is a group of people. Here's something that I think could serve leaders, pastors, people in their growth curve.
So what I'm about to say is going to sound like it's not new, but I don't know very many people who are actually doing what I'm about to describe. And so over the last 20 years, we've learned all of our knowledge of the scripture and the mission of God in the world and all of that. And then we learn about systems, and we learn about trauma, and we learn about implicit bias, and we learn about, all of that stuff that we've learned over the
Power
last 20
dynamics.
years.
Yeah, right.
Power
right.
dynamics, all of that. What we haven't done is we haven't answered the question for pastors and local congregations. How do you shape all of that into a culture? It's like we've got these pieces of information out there. The way I define culture is the culture is just how we do things around here.
Yeah.
And if you use the information, what's it called? The unconscious incompetence to the conscious incompetence to the conscious competence to the unconscious competence. When how we deal with trauma becomes a part of our unconscious competence, when how we deal with implicit bias becomes part of our unconscious competence. And so we're making the most progress. Like I'm thinking about that a lot these days. I'm thinking about how do I do my work? How do Trish and I do our work? How do our team do our work in a way that doesn't just help one person get connected to this information and see it in their own lives, but how do we help this get integrated into the life of the congregation?
Yeah.
And so we're about to begin a 2-year project in October with this guy in Indianapolis that I talked about, a really large church. And we've been coaching everybody on their staff. I think there's about 40 of them for the last 2 years. And they've seen dramatic impact. And so now what they're doing is they've taken their top 12 pastors and they've recruited 12 people who they think are their key lay leaders. And we're about to do a 2-year spiritual formation journey with those. So all of a sudden I'll have 144 people who have had the opportunity to move all that stuff that I just talked about to the unconscious competence, and it becomes more and more a way. This is the way we do things around here. And I'm going to be curious to see how that works, if it works, and what we learn from that. Because until it becomes a part of the culture, I won't have as much impact. I mean, systems of risk change, and one of the most important ways to change a system is to change the way you show up in the system. But when culture is the central in my estimation, the central defining power in a system. And so if we can change the culture, I'm really curious about all that.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. And I think I think pastors inherently know what you're saying is true. If you've been a part of any church that gets healthier or grows in a healthy way, it was usually a few small things that were done with a few people, and then a few other people, then a few other people.
Right.
And
Inside
it shifts
out.
the whole thing.
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
I think a lot of pastors have experienced that, but then you forget you have to keep doing that. Okay, let's do another version of that.
Right.
It's easier to say, we're going to do a sermon series.
Right.
We're going to run a class. We're going to have everybody read a book. It's way easier. It's way harder. I mean, just what you just laid out there. 2 years, 12 groups to 12. I mean, that's a lot of work.
With relational homework.
Yeah.
We have 4 retreats a year, 2 meetings a month with the groups of 12, where at the end of there's going to be homework you're going to do. You're going to come back and reflect with your group on the homework. Wow. And it's not like happy, Jesus. It's like it's hard homework.
Yeah. Well,
muscle building.
Well, and that would be, maybe I'll close with this. Hopefully this will encourage you. When I first engaged you, we did the faith walking thing. I did we now call it intensive, because I think that's a better, it's more honest than retreat. Yeah. And did the intensive. And then I called you and said, Jim, do I really need to do the 6 months thing? I mean, it's a lot of coaching. And now in our emotionally focused deal. It's a 6-month coaching thing. We've kept that model. And you were so gracious to me. You're like, Jay, you're a good guy. You work hard. You pray a lot. You've done a lot of this work. Maybe it wouldn't be useful for you. I don't know. I'm not sure. I can't tell you what to do. I appreciate you asking. I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure. I was like, yeah, but come on, Jim, like, convince me. Like, I want to be persuaded. Like, try to persuade me. And you were like, I don't know if I want to do that. I'm not sure if maybe this wouldn't be best for you. And so we did like 2 or 3 versions of that. And then finally I said, okay, come on, just persuade, like, do your best right now. You said, well, here's what I'd want to say. And I think it's important that everybody hears this, because I've said this now.
I don't remember that.
I know. This is why it's so exciting. This is why it's so exciting. I've probably said this 100 times to people.
Wow.
What I'm about to say to you, because it was so impactful for me. You said, Jay, I know you feel like you have, like, you have a lot of energy. You have more energy than you think you do. Right now, you have a ton of energy. What you don't know is how much of your latent energy are you using to manage stuff implicitly. Like, you don't know you're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you have 10 widgets of energy, and you're using 4 or 5 of them managing this kind of anger over here, this desire over there, this fear, this shame over there. And you don't know this. You're using 5 widgets doing that. And you still have 5 widgets of energy. That's a lot of energy.
Mm-hmm.
But your energy is going to drop over time, Jay. You're getting it over time. Then you're going to have 9 widgets, and you're going to have 8, and you're going to have 7. And then you asked me a really interesting question. You said, why do you think so many men, specifically men, have affairs in their 50s? Do you think they have more sexual energy? They probably, because what do you think? And I was like, gosh, I don't know. I've never really thought about that. You said, well, it's because the widgets of energy are going down. Their willingness to just keep playing a game goes away. And they start wanting to get their needs met, and they don't know how, so they do it illicitly. So he says, so Jay, here's the deal. There's a chance you do 6 months of coaching and what we're doing, and it doesn't help you at all. Like, it was a complete waste of your time. But it's also possible that while you have all this energy and you're doing this and nothing's gone wrong, you can do this work and you'll start to notice some things. You can build some new patterns, some new ways of living and being. Or you can just wait till you're in your mid-50s and you can call me and I'll help you. And I was like, that is about as persuasive a thing as I've ever heard. I was like, I'm in. Let's sign up now. And it wasn't fear-based. It was really like, this is just called reality. This is what we call this. This is what's called reality. And of course, it was very, very helpful to me, obviously, and that we're running the things we run. And I think that's an interesting way to get to some of what you've been saying today, which is you just don't know what you don't know. Or there's a certain level of pain, fear, shame, anxiety, worry, disordered desires that you're just used to. And you've managed it. You're like, yeah, sure, I get angry, but it's not as much as it was, or I've dampened the sort of impact of it. Instead of saying, what would it be like if I actually worked on this? What if I could be freed up in a different way? What if I could route that energy differently? But that's not the kind of thing you can access usually on your own, nor will you persist in that change because it's painful. It's awkward. So I only say that story to say I'm personally grateful to you. Massive transformation in my life. And it makes me the kind of guy that now and it was funny because when you said this to me, you're like, well, you'll be 50, 55. I'm almost 50 now. I'm like, uh-oh.
Yes, you are.
Yeah. So I just say that to say, anybody listening, if you have just even an inkling as you're listening to us, like, there's something there I don't know what to do with. Why not get help? If not for yourself, for the sake of your family, for your kids, And at the very least, the lowest common denominator would be, I just want to be a better leader.
Right.
I've learned to live with this, but wouldn't it be great if I served people more effectively? Because there are things we learn to live with. But man, if we've been called by God, it's worth it. Because, we just have a breath, don't we? And you might as well use that. So I'm really grateful for you, Jim. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jay. It's been fun to talk to you today. The work you and the Vineyard are doing is amazing work in the kingdom. I see a lot of the kingdom because I coach people all over the country in a lot of different denominational traditions, and I am cheering you guys on, praying for you regularly, and really eager to see what the next chapter is going to look like.
Thanks, man. Appreciate you. Well, hopefully we'll talk some more. I'll bring you back if you'll come back.
That'll be great.
As we celebrate our 50-year anniversary in the Vineyard, if you're interested in learning more about Vineyard history, there are plenty of resources for you. Check out our show notes for links to books, YouTube videos, and more to learn about Vineyard history and identity. And make sure to keep listening to the podcast this year for stories of Vineyard churches throughout the year.